Hi, I'm here with my mother, Suzanne Weena Hubbard Clay. You can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I am Suzanne, otherwise known as Mama, and Gamma Sue.
And you are originally from?
Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson County.
Mm-hmm. And how long have you been away from home?
I moved to Washington, D.C. Well, this is my mother's and my grandfather's home. So we've had people living here, as far as I can figure, over the last 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
But with your father, we moved from Boston, Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. in 1970. You were 7 months old. So what was that, 68?
Mm-hmm.
And
Now
I've been here ever since.
Now do people call Louisville? What do you hear and where? In what?
You hear Louisville.
Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you to freeform in a minute, but just wanted to hear some words. Talk a little about Derby Day and mint juleps.
Oh, okay. I went to exactly 2 derbies in my lifetime. My mother and father took me to, and also our dear friend and my play sister, Minnie, took me to Churchill Downs when I was like 6 months old for Derby. And then the next time I went to Derby, I was in my early 20s and styling with the big hats and you know, the Southern Belle, all of that. Mint juleps are indigenous to Kentucky, and I never really liked mint juleps. I mean, I'm not a drinker, you know, but it's a holiday time, and there's the parade and the Brown Hotel and all the historic spots focus on the fact that people have come for the last, 150 years to Louisville for that race, which is a high-paying race. And international folks, the Brits, the royalty, the Indian Rajas, and Asian, folks come, the Hollywood stars. So the mint julep is a signal, and people have elaborate silver cups that have their monograms on them. Louisville is a place of hospitality, and as I did my growing up there I was born in 1939, so I'm 71 years old. As I grew up in that period of the 40s and 50s, because of segregation, there was a lively, as a result of that, and also just, I guess it was cultural identity, great pride in the African American community. Well, that word is not comfortable for me, Negro community, and a focus on your home, your garden, entertaining. It was nothing for my mother's friends and my mother and father's friends. Grandfather, Edinburgh Morris Hubbard, was a physician, and he had practiced there for about 35 years. And that's where we lived as a family, with my sister, who's 3 years younger than I am, 4 years younger than I am. It was nothing for those women to have Limoges, china sets, the finest of everything for entertaining. And a great deal of entertaining went on throughout the year and the holidays. But when Derby came, then there was this influx of friends who came. And in those years, we had, and I'm talking about the years before integration in the hotels, and we had, I think, maybe one, it was called a guest house. So people really wouldn't want your friends staying at the guest house, and it was all right, but they would entertain in their homes, and they would have guests there. So there would be a round of breakfasts, and then there would be parties, and these will all be punctuated with mint juleps. And the perfect mint julep, you had to have your silver cup. And of course, the more ostentatious it was, with your monogram and the napkins. And the house got clean before Derby Day. The perfect mint julep would be your bourbon, whiskey, your ice, fresh mint, and that was it, and sugar. And you would put the sugar, some people did it in shakers, you know, the real bartender shaker. You'd put your sugar on top at the bottom, and then you would have the mint, and you'd muddle it, muddle, M-U-D-D-L-E, and that means that you were getting the essence from the mint leaves, and they smell good. And with that bourbon, and then you put your ice cubes in your glass, and then they would like strain it into the glasses, and then top it off with a frond of mint, maybe that long. People got drunk off that stuff because it was beautiful to look at. Different. You don't walk around drinking bourbon with mint and sugar. And they would get sloshed. So from there, that set up the alcohol was just maintained in the system for the entire Derby weekend. And from Churchill Downs and the races, on race day, it's always a Saturday, they would then have the round of parties. And at some of the people's homes, they would have things called burgoo stew, B-U-R-G-O-O, which came from, we were told, from plantations. And then another thing to know about Louisville.
Is that gumbo? Was it like an African?
It was like gumbo, but not, I don't think there was okra in it. It may have been, but it was the amalgam of meats. You had beef, you had pork, you had all kinds of things. I tasted it once, and I didn't like it. Because it was too gamey. But that was one of the dishes indigenous to the area that survived plantation times. Now, the other thing to know is Louisville, Kentucky is ringed, well, it's not ringed, but one of the, as you go up into Paducah and into the mid part of Kentucky, not the mountains, there were the famous horse farms where they actually bred and trained the horses.
Now let me ask you this. Did you go to school with any of the children or from Appalachia? Or do you remember hearing...
I taught them.
Do you were they white children or black children?
From Appalachia, they were generally all white, except for a group of, I mean, Appalachia is a world in itself.
Talk a little bit about Appalachia.
Up in, they call them the hollers, like hollows, but hollers. You have had Irish, Native Americans, African slaves who were either freed or run away, who lived up there. And as the years went on, and we're talking about from the 1700s on, there was so much intermarriage. A lot of jokes have been made about that. But what emerged up there was clans. And you've heard of that's a famous feuding family, the Killicats and somebody else. That really existed up there. And the folks were cut off from the Ohio River is right, it's at the border between Kentucky and Indiana, southern Indiana. But then the grade of the land, and that's lowland, where the Ohio, mighty Ohio, is, and then the land gradually increases. So you go in elevation until you get up into the mountains of Appalachia. And up in there, you've had those groups who prided themselves. Remember the stories of Daniel Boone and Abraham Lincoln, and people had their own small towns. They have cities now, but then they were, and they were really, in the early days, were inaccessible. Well, they didn't even have roads. Well, they had dirt roads, but you had to know where you were going. And once up there, the assimilation occurred. So over the hundreds of years, what emerged was a group of people who, when you look at them, you would say, who are they? They looked that, they had intermarried and blended.
Do you remember how, if you were in a class with some of the children, sort of how they would talk to you?
Well, they were not in our schools.
But the ones that you taught,
the ones that I taught, yeah. After the 1950s, and that's when I was teaching. I was a high school English teacher for about 3 years, and then I got in. I smelled the interesting blood of politics, and I became a part of the educational scene in Kentucky. And I operated the first Head Start programs in Jefferson County, which was in our big city, and then in surrounding areas.
How did the children sound when they would talk?
Can
you do a bad imitation?
I do a bad imitation, but it's very nasal.
Can you approximate it?
Yes, I can approximate it because I'm thinking about your cousin, Susanna. It's, and my sister too, it's a lot like this. Hi, Annie Sue, how you doing? I'm fine. And she, by the way, has 2 master's degrees and is a dedicated elementary school teacher. But what you hear is the nasal, that hillbilly kind of like cadence, and it's...
so when you're talking to her on the phone, what would an improvised conversation...
When I talk with her and my sister...
How does she sound?
Annie Sue, how you doing? And I immediately go right back and pick up whatever tones that I remember, and I give them back to her. And the minute I finish my conversation, then I turn around, I again talk, not with that nasal twang. Now,
there's a joke that you have told me over the years about a reverend who lived in your community.
Oh, yes.
And I would love for you to reenact, because not only are you wonderful with characters, but it gives you an idea of the dialect of and cadences of many of the Kentuckians of that time.
This was my late brother-in-law, and his name was Donald. His father was a Baptist minister in Paducah, Kentucky, Reverend Burton. And Reverend Burton was a tall, majestic man. Had a paunch and a voice on him. I said, absolutely deafening when he decided it would be. He had a thriving parish of church, and the ladies absolutely loved him. There's nothing that, there was no dishes, no cakes, no pies, no specialties, anything that the Reverend Burton wanted, he got. And this was very pleasing to his wife, Arwilda Burton, because she didn't like to cook anyway.
What was her name?
Arwilda.
And so they called her Arwilda.
Well, she was Mrs. Burton, and she was the pastor's
Now, what
wife.
did he call her?
Arwilda. His first name was Lloyd, And so Lloyd and Arwilda had 3 children, and the youngest one was my brother-in-law. The interesting thing is Reverend Burton was something of a psychologist. He had a salary, and he also did, and this happens in Virginia now, I'm aware, in some parts of rural areas. He had his main church in Paducah, the big town, but he also had outlying parishioners, and he would travel to them, and they would meet in sometimes schoolrooms or meeting rooms, and he would conduct services. Reverend Burton figured out that he needed to have a steady flow of money because he had these 3 growing children, and they wanted to go to college. His wife was a school teacher, but money being what it is, we're talking about the 1960s, latter 50s and 60s. So Donald, my brother-in-law, as a little boy, he and his sisters would always know when their father, Reverend Burton, was about to increase the larder and the checking account, because he would deliver a sermon, and he had a beautiful voice, and he was majestic, and he would wear his special robes, which were white with gold trim. And in the process of preaching, and I don't even know thematically or in terms of the Bible what the text reference was, but he would always get to that point when he would say, I am a Christian, and as all Christians, we got to walk the water. And the sisters with their fans would say, yes, Reverend. And Reverend Burton would work them up to a crescendo, at which point singing without accompaniment, because he had this gorgeous, like, deep voice, he would get on the pew in the front, and he would then enact walking the water, and the sisters would just, yes, Reverend. And then at that point, he'd always have a sister to get out in the aisle and say, oh, Reverend Burton, and she'd faint. And the ushers, they were called, I can't think of what they call them, the stewardesses, all dressed in white. They looked like nurses almost. They would come and, fan Sister Jones and prop her up. And so get her hat lined up again.
Get her wig straight.
No, mainly her hat, because the ladies, they were all into hatitude. But the interesting thing is, he would start from the front of the church, and Donald says he would walk the water until he got to the back, and coming back, he was singing. Immediately before his foot hit the first pew, the ushers began passing out the basket collection trays, and the sisters and the choir had joined him in this. I mean, all this was orchestrated. Donald said it would be $5, $10, $20, and of course these people didn't have lots of money, but they were moved. After Reverend Burton delivered that sermon, Donald said that it was then that items for the family were purchased, big items, as for example a new washing machine, a payment on tuition for one of his sisters, even the Reverend, I think the church, they gave him something on his car, but he was able to add to it. It was very interesting that that sermon was delivered, as Donald says, before Christmas, before school started in the fall. Just funny.
Now, I'll have a couple words. This is wonderful. Because you're being very proper for this interview, which I appreciate. But when you were, I'm going to give you a couple words, and if you could just repeat them after me in what I know to be your Kentucky cadence, I'd appreciate it.
But you do understand that my mother was a Washingtonian.
I understand that, Ma, but
reason,
Suzanne, for the purposes of this dialect interview, I need you to cooperate.
Okay.
All right. So, hi.
Hi.
Now, how would you say it if you were 16 or 17 in Kentucky?
Well, I was such a flirt.
All right. So how would you say it?
I say hi.
Hi. Caroline.
Caroline.
Christopher.
Christopher.
Jim.
Jim.
Hand.
Hand.
Light.
Light.
Bright.
Bright.
Christmas.
Christmas.
Love.
Love.
Frankfurt.
Frankfurt.
Garden.
Garden.
Kentucky.
Kentucky.
Car.
Car.
Mother.
Mother.
I love you. Thank you, Ma.
But you needed to tell them that I was an English teacher and a little bit.
Well, Ma, and they'll know that at the end. Just say, just wave goodbye.
And I taught at University of Maryland.
Bye. Thank you very much.